Welcome to Cold War Conversations, the home of real stories of the Cold War.
When we play in the woods, there was still defense like trenches that left over from Second World War. And we still were finding like artifacts. Sometime, if you're lucky, you will find hand grenade.
This is Cold War Conversations. If you're new here, you've come to the right place to listen to Cold War history. Please make sure you follow us in your podcast app so you don't miss future episodes. Born in Lviv in Ukraine in 1958, Ihor grew up in a city where borders shifted but memories endured. In this episode, he recalls his childhood shaped by silence, censorship, and family stories that could only be told in private. While official history came from Moscow, a very different past survived in the countryside, passed down by grandparents who'd lived through empire, war, and occupation. This is a personal account of what it meant to grow up in Ukraine, then part of the Soviet Union, during the 1960s and 70s. I'm delighted to welcome Ihor to our Cold War conversation.
I was born in November 1958 in the western part of Ukraine, in Lviv, which had very complicated history by itself, but my father was professor at Polytechnic University, pretty much spent his entire life in academia, and my mother was pharmacist. She worked at local pharmacy. Unfortunately, my parents are gone. And so I grew up in this city, but I spent a lot of like summer vacation, winter vacation at small farm at my grandparents. It's outside, I would say, uh, 30 miles outside of Lviv, closer to Polish border. And just spending time on countryside was more relaxed because in the city, my parents never talk about their past, their uprising, because it was Soviet Union and it's like you couldn't go to church because church was separate from the state. So it was really hard to keep tradition at home and in the city. And plus, because my father was professor at Polytechnic University, basically, you try not to do what to be considered wrong thing to do. But when I spent time with my grandparents, I really heard a lot of stories from my grandfather and my grandmother. My grandfather was in First World War in Austrian army, so fought war like in like Dolomite area, and then was a prisoner of war, was captured by Russian because Lviv then was part of Austro-Hungarian Empire. So, and his brother, which is my great uncle, also fought in First World War, was prisoner of war, like caught by Russian, then escaped from Russian prisoner of war camp, came back to Kiev, and he is actually was the one who started to form our armed forces for independent Ukraine in 1917. And he actually was killed in action in 1918 outside of Kiev. So he was commander of machine gun company. So I heard a lot of old military tradition, and not only military tradition, but about this like authenticity and how complicated what people went through two different wars and what changed. So the common joke between my grandparents and people from the village was basically you can spend your entire life in one place and live in four different countries. Austro-Hungary until 1918, Poland from 1918 through 1939, Soviet Union from 1939 to 1990, and then independent Ukraine.
You were living in one of those areas where the borders were really fluid. Did your grandparents talk much about their experiences in World War II?
The World War II, actually, they talk a little bit, but less, because then my grandfather was almost like too old to get like drafted during World War II, and he had some health issues. He was okay, but by army standard, he wasn't able to fight But what was interesting, what they told me when World War II started, a lot of Ukrainians thought that Germany will bring them independence. And this is where misconception comes that a lot of people would say Ukrainian were Nazi collaborators. They were not. They didn't like being occupied by Russia or be part of Soviet Union. And they thought that German troops will bring independence to Ukraine. And from what my grandfather told me from the beginning, the war was like more or less civilized. German soldiers stay in their house, brought food, brought chocolate for kids, pay for their stay, and then got up in the morning, left, and came back to the house to spend a night. And but it was in early years of the war, and then later on everything has changed. And then also then Ukrainian realized that Germany has no interest to keep Ukraine as independent country. Germany wants just basically be everybody's slaves, like forced labor for Germany. Then Ukrainian people who were trying to support German basically were fighting war on both fronts. There was like Ukrainian insurgent army. So they basically from 1942 they fought against German and Russians at the same time. So they were caught between two fires, so to speak.
And it sounds like your family were not huge fans of communism then.
No, to some extent, we live behind Iron Curtain because everything information was censored, so you couldn't really you couldn't turn on and watch CNN or BBC. There were like two channels on TV, and channel one, channel two, and they were basically most of the stuff was broadcasting from Moscow, some of them from Kiev, but it was very censored. So the one thing I remember when I was growing up, when my father was listening to Voice on America on shortwave radio, and it was so interesting because there were like Voice of America was heavily jammed, and I remember we were sitting by. It was in old days like shortwave radio stationary still with lamps in the back like tubes, like old TV, and you listen to something, and when conversation is neutral there is no jamming, and then something and America and Vietnam, and then you hear this solid like background noise because it was the same when invasion of Afghanistan started, because war in Afghanistan started, like public didn't really know a lot about the war. All we knew that it basically Soviet Union is helping like Afghanistan to become independent country, and they build school and build roads. So real information about war was not accessible to public. Period.
And listening on shortwave radio was not great at the best of times because stations would fade in and fade out just through the atmospherics.
To come with additional antennas, I remember graphite I was building. I was some like a fan to build shortwave radios. So we were like using copper wire to extend like hand over the windows, scarred drapes. Yeah, but it was hard.
Yeah. Did you listen to the BBC World Service as well?
Actually, I didn't listen that much because I didn't speak English to a certain extent. So was sorry. What we listen mostly on short radios, we listen to like Polish radio station because because we're right across the border, so Polish broadcast was accessible, and not only Polish radio broadcast, but TV movies. So the first restaurant that I watch on is like TV with antenna like pointing towards like Polish border, and then pretty much so a lot of history about my family and history pretty much of Ukraine. I learned mostly from my grandparents. I went to school, and when school gives you like brief history, and to some extent I would say that education was pretty good. We study history, we did in chronological order from ancient times, ancient Greece, ancient Rome, and then we move on. So we cover all chapters, but still, for example, the history of Second World War was basically taught in order to make Russia a main contributor, and Russia won the war and everything else. So it's so
Yeah.
we got information, but a lot of information was censored.
And what sort of accommodation were you living in?
When I was born, we lived in, it's not even, it's, say, with a two-room apartment, because the way how they define apartment in Ukraine, they would call by number of bedrooms, but they would call by number of rooms, and kitchen would be excluded. So first apartment that I was born, basically, it was two of us, me and my sister. My sister is 2 years older than me. So we had kitchen, we had two rooms. One room was my parents' bedroom, and second room was dining room, but also acts like with two couches. I slept on one couch and my sister slept on another couch. And there was only one bathroom. You basically get up in the morning, you take your turns. But frankly, even our accommodation were considered to be privileged, because a lot of people live in communal flats, which you have only one room and you share kitchen and bathroom.
And what were your neighbors like? So was this in a this was in a block of flats you were in?
Actually, we were slightly more privileged because we live in old town, so the building was probably built like in late 20s. So it was standalone four-story building. The architecture of Lviv, it's to some extent, it's very similar to architecture of Vienna or Salzburg, because there was a lot of impact from Gothic architecture, because from Austrian time. So it was not like newly built flat. There was massive development in the 50s, 60s, when the flat but was a very low ceiling. We, all things considered, we had pretty luxury apartment. We have high ceilings, just like tall windows. It's like all the apartment buildings in Paris or in Vienna. So this was this similar type.
Did you have any relatives who lived in the West?
Oh, this is a very interesting question. Yes, so mm, my my uncle, so my father's old brother, just like when the war started, he was drafted to the army, and basically all he had backpack, and he left my grandparents' village, and then so he pretty much was MIA. So my grandmother thought that he was killed, and she basically, and it's a very like touchy story. And 20 years later, in 1960, somebody came from America, one of relatives, like to somebody else in the village, and they stopped by my grandmother's house, and they said, "Your son, Yaroslav, is alive. He has family, and he lives in New York, in Queens, New York." And then it was shock for my mother, and but they were afraid to send any letters, because they were afraid that parents will be sent to Siberia. So the story about my uncle, he was wounded, and he was in the prisoner of war camp, and then he was released by American troops in Italy. He was in camp in Rimini, Italy, and he was released by American troops. And then just he basically he made to America. He went through Roosevelt Island, just medical, everything else, and then he did odd jobs in New York City. And then war in Korea started, and he enlisted in U.S. Army and during Korean War. And then when he got discharged from the military after the war, he got his citizenship. As they say, he got his citizenship by blood. but they were afraid to write letters because they were heavily censored. And even after 1960s, they started to write to my grandmother, but the letter was signed, the address was not his name, not Chernik, but somebody else's last name. And he sent it only to village. They would never send letter to my father in the city. Because if you in university, your correspondence was more heavily censored than everyone else because you're supposed to bring new engineers, new generation of like workers for Soviet Union. So everything has to be perfect. And even when my father knew it, it was still kept in secret. We are not advertising it to anybody. It was just we just kept this information to ourselves.
Wow. Well, I'm presuming your grandparents never actually saw their son again then, or did
Actually,
you
no,
visit?
they actually saw him after after Soviet Union collapse and Ukrainian declared independence. So he came to Ukraine in 1992, and my grandfather was gone by then. But he came to the village and he saw my grandmother, and I will tell it was like a heartbreaking story because he came. I drove him from the city, and he was still very careful because even it was independent Ukraine, but he came as part of like a tourist group, and the tourist group was still watched by KGB because KGB was then in like disarray. Here's new government, but they technically still KGB of USSR, so they didn't know what to do, but so they still performed their roles. They were watching tourist group who just what they did, who they saw. And so my uncle saw his mother briefly for a few hours and then he left. It was heartbreaking because I knew that this was the last time that she will see him because she was 92 by then. And I have to tell you, this generation, like my uncle, they were damaged by Second World War. They never recovered. We were driving through the village, and there were a few older guys that he grew up with them together, and he recognized them immediately. I said, "Listen, uncle, do you want me to stop?" The guy said, "You know what? It was a long time ago. They probably don't even remember me. Let's just keep going." And
Wow.
it was very sad. It just
That must have been such an emotional meeting with his mother
oh, just
there.
it's I
Um,
know, just it was very emotional. It was heartbreaking because when we were leaving, he said it's like last goodbye, as they say.
were you told within your family not to mention things outside the family circle?
Oh
I
yes,
get.
absolutely, yeah. So actually, I have one very close friend that we grew up together, and so my father was his godfather because in Ukraine there is tradition. You have father and you have godfather and godmother. So they actually knew because my parents went to school together with my friend parents, and they also have like relatives in America. But beside that, in my circle of school friends, even when I went later on to Polytechnic University, I never talk about to anybody about like my relatives like abroad. And it was my father told me straight and simple: just keep your mouth shut. If otherwise, I will lose my job.
Yeah, completely understood. Your parents have no idea that the Soviet Union is going to disappear in
Oh yeah,
the early 90s. So in that situation, you just keep your head down and keep everything squeaky clean and just try and rub along as best you can. So what was your school education like? I presume there was quite a lot of propaganda in there and potentially some military training as well.
yeah. School education was interesting. Yes, overall, we basically the good thing basically school was in Ukrainian, but and most of our teachers were like from just from local teachers from the area from Western Ukraine. No, but the same, they had to be careful. So we learn history and this literature. But when we study Russian, we not only study Russian language, but we also study like Russian literature. Because the point was they want you to get real good grasp. So we read all classic like Russian like writers, Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Chekhov. One piece it was mandatory reading, and Dostoevsky, Crime and Punishment was the same, was mandatory in school. But I couldn't. But it's such a hard book. I tried to read it when I was like 13 years old. There's no way you could understand it. Overall, education was good. So there were like we had good math teachers, biology, but when came to history, basically there was a lot of propaganda. And then, so when we started, was basically we all had been told that. So I was in school in mid 70s. So this was socialism, and according to our teachers, basically we're not in communism society yet, because society is not ready for communism, because the socialist, everybody gets what he produced and get compensated for it, and communism, everybody gets what they need without contributing. So it was very confusing, yes, but it was a lot of propaganda. And speaking of military, basically we had physical education, and we also have military like classes, like once a week, like 4 hours. You basically were not military uniform, but something similar, khaki like collar, like pants and jacket. And we basically we had shooting range in the basement of school, which is like funny, school and shooting range. And we shot like a 22 caliber rifle. And then I think age 15, I was in eighth grade. Then we learned how to operate and shoot Kalashnikov AK-74. It was very so safety was very important, and the teachers who taught military education were like uh, retired like army officers. Everybody got only 3 rounds. You load 3 rounds in magazine, and you shoot 3 rounds, and you're done. And then you have to do detach the magazine, do control check, and everything else. And also physical education was there was a lot of focus on fitness, and we even had this badges. Basically it's called ready for work and defense, and there were like three. There was a master category, because you have to run 100 meters, you have to do like 25 push up, you have to do 10 chin ups, and you have to shoot like 22 rifle, and you have to score a certain number on target. And then just you would get this like badge, basically say you're ready to work and defend your country.
Wow. Wow. Not like a UK school by any means. What did you do in your spare time with your friends?
No, you see, spare time we pretty much have like regular childhood. When I was growing up, it's probably different now, but when I was growing up, there was not a lot of places where you could go after school. So we would walk from school to the park and empty lot and play football, like soccer, or basically play in the parks, kind of like hide and seek, or like playing almost like a war. There were like you're hiding, and there were like water pistols. So you will put water in a pistol, and you'll be chasing each other. You'll be hiding behind the trees. So I think overall our childhood was probably like everybody else's childhood to some extent. But
Yeah.
the more freedom I felt when I went for summer vacation to my grandparents' house, and the rule was you help with the garden in the morning, and then you play rest of the day. So I was working in the morning. I was feeding like livestock. When my grandparents didn't have the farm, because then it was Soviet union, so there was collective farm, and as household, you're allowed to have only one cow, and you can have two pigs, and then number of chickens and everything else. So I would take cows to the pasture and just bring them back and help my grandparents with potato patch. But then I really enjoy my free time because on countryside, you go fishing, you play in the woods, you build. So the most memorable activity from childhood is like from countryside, from my grandparents' village.
I can imagine. And you were in the Young Pioneers and the
Oh yeah,
Komsomol
absolutely. So we were,
groups as well.
this was not even a choice. I was young. I was young pioneers, and then we like next step up after young pioneer was Komsomol, which is youth, like almost pre precursors like to become member of Communist Party. But in, in school, you basically it was even a question. Everybody has to member of Komsomol, and you get this small, tiny ID card with the stamps that you pay your duty. It was symbolic. You pay like 10 kopecks, whatever, not even a ruble. And also in school, so once in a while, just be part of the school activity. They will take. It's like, for example, if school in America they take you for field day, go to the farm. We will take they will take us for field day and we play war games. So they will break us into group, and you will have one group will have red shoulder boards, and one group has like blue shoulder boards. And you run against each other and you throw somebody in the snow, and as long as you grab his shoulder boards, then he's dead. And then so it was interesting entertainment, to say at least.
And when you're a kid and you're playing like the games with the water pistols, is it like some of your friends are pretending to be NATO and you're pretending to be the Soviet Union, or did that just not come into it? It was
No,
just
actually,
enemy.
just it wasn't common. It was mostly like we watch a lot of Native American, not Western, but like in like movies about American Indians. But most of movie is based after Fenimore Cooper novels, but most of them were like filmed in Yugoslavia, which was so funny. So Chinachuk was like Yugoslavian actor. So we play in Indians and like white people. No, but no, and we also yeah, NATO, but we play like Russian against Germans. So the
Yeah.
ones were like Germans and everybody else was Russian. And
Okay. So refighting World War II
yeah,
then.
so
Yeah.
there was a lot of resemblance after World War II. We still, my grandparents live by small wooded area, and we still were finding like artifacts from Second World War, like empty shells. Like sometime, if you're lucky, you will find hand grenade, but it was like slightly just hard to find. And when we play in the woods, there was still defense like trenches that left over from Second World War.
Wow.
So the history
Wow.
was right there.
And academically at school, what was your best subject?
Academically, I was really in school. I I was history buff. I love history. I love geography. So frankly, there were my like two favorite subjects, and I read most of history books that we had to read during our history classes. I read them even eh, before we were assigned to read them, and I love history of just pretty much everything. But I love medieval times, and then history of Ukraine. When you go to Kazakh's war, like from 16th century, and then war between Ukraine and Poland, and just and all this, and then it was the big thing was then big war was Crimean War. This is when Sevastopol really came on the map because Sevastopol was port already, and a lot of battles were like around three or four like Russian admirals from Crimean War like buried in Sevastopol. The funny thing not a lot of people know that. If you look at Russian Navy flag, it's St. Andrew's flag.
Yeah, it's the blue cross on a white background.
Yeah, and you know what? Because one of the first Russian admirals was Scottish Admiral Mackenzie, and somehow he settled in Sevastopol because this time it was still, I think, during Peter the Great. There were a lot of Scots or Danes who travel around, and he got good terms, land, whatever. And there is even area in Sevastopol called Mackenzie's Ridge.
Brilliant. I never knew that. That's a great
Yeah.
story that it's based on the Scottish flag.
Yeah,
Fantastic.
I will send you the link. It's a great
Yeah,
story.
brilliant. I'll include that in the episode notes when you send that to me. Now, normally in the Eastern Bloc, to go to university, you've got to have the right parents, and your parents have got to be supporters of the regime and things like that. Did you manage to go to university, didn't you? You were recognized as being talented enough to go there.
Yeah, actually, you know what? You would have to write parents if you would go to a specific university. So, Polytechnic University, just engineering school, basically, everybody could go as long, yes, they would check your background. But for example, there was, I went from, I studied electrical engineering. So, I was in electrical engineering department. And then there was what they call uh, radio technical department. And radio technical department, because it's radio communication signals, so they would check your background more thoroughly. So for example, if you would have relatives abroad, like in one of Western country, you would never become a student and admitted to radio engineering department, but electric engineer just was fine. So, but there were specific institution. For example, there is university in Moscow, University of International Relationships. So you would have to have somebody member of Communist Party and highly in, because then for this position, because this is like future diplomats and state service, so you would have to be from, you would have to have right pedigree.
Understood. Understood. So you're accepted into the Lviv State Polytechnic University in 1975. You
Correct.
tell me what life was like in that polytechnic and what you were being taught.
Just it's it's, I would say, in university it was pretty much like a regular university, but first 2 years also there was heavy influence on, it's like we didn't study history, but there was subject history of Communist Party, and we had been taught history of Communist Party in details, and just starting from Marx through Ulyanov, Lenin, Stalin, and all of the Politburo members, general secretaries, and then there was also philosophy, and the same. There was philosophy of communism, stages of socialism, like communism, and how to achieve, how to get to it. But everything else after first 2 years were basically technical disciplines, just electric machine, like power generation, distribution networks. But also in university, we had military department on more like larger scales. There was entire campus dedicated to military. We had our own trucks. We didn't have armor carrier because it was combat, but we have our trucks from transportation. We have different equipment. Just we have this. There was like armory, like for like light weapons, like Kalashnikov, basically when you go to shooting range. And military education was taught by some of them were active duty officers that were like that had recruitment job, or some of them just were like teachers at university, just like teaching military education. And what was interesting, it was full dedicated day. So I remember it was every Wednesday. You get up in the morning, you put a military uniform, you go to what they call military department, Voyenная Cafedra in Russian or Ukrainian, and you spend there the whole day. And we will study tactical math. And the concept was United States is not your friend, United States potential aggressor. We study technical maps. We look at east coast of United States. I remember New London submarine base was one of primary target, and then there's Kings Bay in Georgia, like large, even now, large heavy duty submarine base. So I saw those bases on the map in like 1978. It was like fascinating if you think about it.
So you'd probably not seen a map in that sort of detail of the United States.
No, just I never seen it before. And over there, what was like what they call a tactical map. So it was very detailed. There were like roads, highway. There was 95 mark across. There were like inlet, like New London, were like because some submarine base is deep in the mouth of rivers. And what we also saw, like we saw movies about American Navy, and somebody asked just how did we get this movie? And the question was, you don't need to know, but there was documentary like about yes, aircraft carrier. Basically, they show aircraft carriers, they show crew, they show what they do, like with the food at spare time, how they and when we started to watch the title before this, they start to show the movie proper of GRU Army Intelligence. So nobody knew how this movie were obtained.
What were they training you for then? Because they're
Yeah,
providing you
so
with
my
specific information there.
yeah, everybody like a different department has like different what they call army specialty. So mine was like I would say it's signal corps because ours was radio communications. And after graduation from university, we all will be lieutenants. So technically, my position was like rank lieutenant and commander of radio communication platoon. So, and
Okay,
so
so by going to university, you were destined to become an officer within the Soviet army.
actually, it's yes and no. So you would be what they call here ROTC. You will have the rank, you will be officer in reserve. And some people, it's like some people never serve and some people serve. If you look at the ratio, I would say from it's probably uh, 20 probably from all my colleagues that we all my friends that we got graduated, I would say probably 15% served. But the way you serve, you basically you it's like you're a commissioned officer, but you have contract for 2 or 3 years, 2 years in the army, 3 years in the navy, and then after that you have option. You can either extend your contract or you will get discharged. But if you extend your contract, you have to you commit to next 23 years, because in Soviet military you would have be 25 years. Doesn't matter what you like it, you don't like it, you commit to serve. You have to.
It's too late if you don't
Yeah.
you don't fancy it. So when you graduate, you actually start a professional career. So where are you working?
Yeah, so just I graduated in 1980, and my first job was basically just at it. I would say it's a mixture of radio equipment, telecommunication manufacturing. So I was like a project manager on assembly line. So I basically was checking logistic because let's say we would have to produce a certain number of devices, and it was all basically order from Ministry of Defense. It was military equipment, and just it's basically like encryption, like communication channels, all in one thing. But what was shocking to me, the quality between products for civil life and military. In military, everything went through rigorous tests. Be it when this equipment was ready to be packed and shipped, basically, it will have to go to freeze camera, and it will be turned on, and it will have to work from plus 50 centigrade to minus 30. And you open the door then, and because it has to run control test, and if test run, if everything shows 0 on display, so it's good to go. If it's not 0, if it has error, it has to go back and be redone again. So this is when I first noticed what was the difference between what's made for army and what made for public consumption. I worked there for a year and a half, and I didn't like it much. And then just I move on. Basically, I work at like university. It was forestry university, and I was working at computer center, but it was old-fashioned computer center. We had this huge room and this huge computer. Basically, it took entire room, and we have perforated cars and magnetic tapes for memory. And this is where my next job was. And in 1983, I got a letter in the mail from military recruitment office, and I was invited for interview. And then when you get this letter, you would have to sign for it because the postman delivered it in hand, but he buzzed at the door. He wanted to be sure that I acknowledge. He wanted to have my signature, my acknowledgement that I received the letter.
And what did that letter invite you to do?
Oh, I basically have to come like to Army Recruitment Center at such time and day for interview, and that's it. And it was like 3 days later, I show up for interview, and they ask me just like general questions, just if I have any relatives abroad. The answer was no, and the guy said, "Oh, it's good." And then they asked me, "So, comrade, would you like to serve in Soviet military for 2 years? It's a great job. You'll be an officer. You'll get good paycheck." And I learned before that you cannot say no because you will go anyway, but they will send you not the most favorable place. And I said, it will be an honor. I like to serve. And the guy said, okay, here. So just go back to your HR department and they will take care of everything. And each HR department had what they call first section. And first section was usually HR person, but who was liaison with military. And they usually were like retired army officers. And they walked to HR. He said, "Oh, it's great. Congratulations. And you will see what real life looks like. You will be defending your country." And I pretty much in no time, I got everything. I got all my like papers from work. And 3 days later, I was on basically pack my things. They told you take all necessity, change your clothes because when you arrive, you will get military uniform and everything else. And I was on the train from Lviv to Vilnius, Lithuania, because the training facility where my like papers were to arrive to Šiauliai, which is smaller town outside of Vilnius, Lithuania, and this is where training started.
Yes, you've guessed it. You're going to have to wait for next week's episode where you'll hear about Ihor's entry into the Soviet army and his military service with the Ministry of the Interior. Do make sure that you're following us in your podcast app so you don't miss that episode. The episode extras such as videos, photos and other content are available via a link in the episode information. The podcast wouldn't exist without the generous efforts of our financial supporters, and I'd like to thank one and all of them for keeping the podcast on the road. The Cold War conversation continues in our Facebook discussion group. Just search for Cold War Conversations in Facebook. Thanks very much for listening and look forward to seeing you next week.